Jessie Montez thought letting a stranger crash on her couch would be the biggest mistake of her carefully planned life until she opened the door at 2:30 a.m. and felt her world tilt on its axis in the most deliciously dangerous way possible. The silk robe clung to her rain-dampened skin as she stood frozen in her doorway, taking in 6 feet of pure masculine perfection. Aiden Brad filled her threshold like he'd been carved from dark marble, his white t-shirt plastered to a chest that made her forget she was a respectable marketing director with a reputation to maintain. Water dripped from his close-cropped hair, tracing paths down his strong jaw that her fingertips suddenly ached to follow. "I'm sorry to bother you this late." His voice carried the warm roughness of someone caught in an impossible situation. "My truck broke down in the storm. I saw your light on and thought—" Jessie's breath caught as thunder crashed overhead, the sound echoing the storm building inside her chest. She should say no. Everything rational screamed that inviting this man into her pristine downtown apartment would shatter the careful boundaries she'd built around her orderly existence. But the way his dark eyes held hers with desperate hope made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with good sense. "You're soaked," she heard herself say, stepping aside before logic could intervene as Aiden crossed her threshold. His cologne mixed with the scent of rain and something indefinably masculine that made her knees weak. The midnight blue silk suddenly felt transparent under his grateful gaze, and Jessie became hyper-aware of how the thin fabric skimmed her thighs. How her braless state beneath the delicate material created a silhouette that was far from neighborly. "Let me get you a towel," she murmured, her voice breathier than intended. In the bathroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror, blonde hair tousled from restless sleep, green eyes bright with an excitement she didn't want to name. When she returned, Aiden stood dripping in her living room, looking impossibly large among her carefully chosen furnishings. Their fingers brushed as she handed him the towel, and the electric shock from that simple contact made her gasp. His eyes widened, and she realized he'd felt it too, this magnetic pull that defied every rational thought screaming in her head. "Thank you," Aiden said softly, his voice carrying layers of meaning that had nothing to do with gratitude for shelter. Jessie nodded, not trusting herself to speak as she watched him towel his hair, the simple motion revealing glimpses of toned abdomen that made her mouth go dry. The couch suddenly seemed impossibly far away, and she realized that offering him a place to sleep was about to become the least complicated part of this arrangement. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but Jessie knew the real tempest was just beginning. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through Jessie's apartment like a promise she hadn't made, pulling her from restless sleep filled with dreams of storm-darkened eyes and rain-soaked skin. She padded barefoot toward the kitchen, her silk nightgown whispering against her thighs, expecting to find her automatic coffee maker doing its programmed morning duty. Instead, she found Aiden Brad standing at her counter, shirtless and magnificent. In the early morning light, Jessie froze in the doorway, her breath catching as she took in the view that no amount of professional composure could have prepared her for. His broad shoulders moved with fluid grace as he reached for mugs in her cabinet, the muscles of his back rippling beneath dark skin that seemed to glow in the golden sunrise streaming through her windows. The Loslung jeans he'd slept in rode dangerously low on his hips, revealing a strip of toned abdomen that made her mouth go desert dry. "Morning," Aiden said without turning around, his voice still rough with sleep. "Hope you don't mind, I made coffee. Couldn't sleep much after the storm." The domesticity of the moment hit her like a physical blow. This was her kitchen, her morning routine. But somehow, Aiden moved through the space like he belonged, there like they'd been sharing mornings for years instead of hours. He turned to face her, extending a steaming mug with a smile that did dangerous things to her pulse. "Thank you," Jessie managed, hyper-aware of how her nightgown must look in the morning light. How his eyes seemed to notice the way the silk clung to curves she usually kept, carefully hidden beneath tailored business suits. Their fingers brushed. Again, as she accepted the coffee, and that same electric current from last night sparked between them with renewed intensity. Aiden's gaze lingered on her face, then dropped briefly to where the thin straps of her nightgown had slipped off one shoulder during sleep. "I should shower," he said, his voice carrying undertones that made heat pool low in her stomach. "Get out of your way before you have to get ready for work." The mention of work should have restored her sanity, reminded her of the careful professional image she'd cultivated. Instead, all Jessie could think about was the logistics of sharing her single bathroom, the intimacy of morning routines, the way he'd look emerging from her shower with water droplets clinging to that perfect chest. "There's no rush," she heard herself say, the words escaping before rational thought could intervene. "I don't have any early meetings today." Aiden's smile deepened. And Jessie realized she'd just extended an invitation to linger in this dangerous domesticity that felt far too natural for comfort. Jessie spent the morning trying to focus on quarterly projections, but her mind kept drifting to the memory of Aiden's morning smile and the way her coffee had tasted better when he'd made it. The illusion of normalcy shattered when Jessica Martinez appeared in her office doorway with predatory curiosity gleaming in her eyes. "So," Jessica said, settling into the chair across from Jessie's desk with theatrical casualness, "heard you had some excitement last night. Mrs. Chen from your building called her sister, who happens to be my neighbor." Jessie's stomach clenched. The small-town gossip network that thrived even in downtown's corporate towers had found her faster than she'd anticipated. "Just helped someone whose car broke down in the storm." Jessie replied carefully, her fingers tightening around her pen. Jessica's perfectly manicured eyebrow arched with skepticism. "As someone who's apparently still there this morning. Tall, dark, and handsome, according to the neighborhood watch." Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd built her career on knowing everyone's business. "Be careful, Jess, you know how these things look, especially in our industry. Clients have ... expectations about the company we keep." The words hit like ice water, each syllable a reminder of the carefully constructed professional image Jessie had spent years building. After Jessica left with a knowing smile, Jessie stared at her computer screen, seeing nothing but the implications of choices she'd made without thinking. By the time she reached her apartment that evening, Jessie had almost convinced herself that maintaining professional distance was the rational choice. Then she opened her door and found Aiden crouched beneath her kitchen sink, his muscled torso gleaming with perspiration as he wrestled with her perpetually broken cabinet door. "Thought I'd fix this for you," he said, glancing up with a smile that made her forget every rational thought Jessica had planted in her head. "Need someone to hold the flashlight steady." Jessie found herself kneeling beside him in the cramped space beneath the sink, their bodies pressed impossibly close as she aimed the beam where he directed. The scent of his skin mixed with sawdust and something indefinably masculine made her head spin. When he reached for a screwdriver, his bare chest brushed against her arm, and Jessie felt every rational defense crumble. "Little to the left, Aiden," murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he leaned closer to examine a stubborn hinge. Jessie's hand trembled, making the light waver as his proximity sent heat racing through her veins. In this small space, surrounded by the domestic intimacy of shared tasks and whispered directions, Jessica's warnings felt like echoes from another world, one where desire could be controlled by professional considerations and neighborhood gossip. The second thunderstorm in 2 nights found Jessie and Aiden sharing wine on her couch, the fixed cabinet door a testament to the domestic intimacy that had been building between them all week. Lightning illuminated her living room in silver flashes while rain drummed against the windows with increasing intensity, creating a cocoon of warmth that made the outside world feel impossibly distant. "Tell me about your marriage," Jessie said. Softly, the Malbec making her bold enough to ask questions that daylight would have rendered too personal. Aiden's laugh held no humor as he swirled his wine. Sarah wanted the carpenter's paycheck without the carpenter's hands. Loved the idea of a blue-collar husband until she realized that meant coming home dirty, having sawdust in my hair. His dark eyes found Jessie's. She said I embarrassed her at company parties. The pain in his voice made Jessie's chest tighten with protective fury. She was an idiot, was she? Aiden set down his glass and turned to face her fully. Look at you, Jessie, marketing director, downtown apartment, designer, everything. What are you doing with someone like me? The question hung between them like a challenge. Jessie felt the weight of Jessica's warnings, the careful professional image she'd cultivated, the expectations that came with her polished world. But sitting here in the stormlit darkness, watching shadows play across Aiden's face, none of that seemed to matter. I'm falling for you, she whispered, the words escaping before courage could abandon her. The confession shattered the last pretense of casual friendship. Aiden's hand came up to cup her face with devastating tenderness, his thumb tracing her cheekbone like she was something precious he'd found in the wreckage of his carefully ordered life. Jessie, he breathed. Her name, a prayer, and a warning wrapped in velvet darkness. Their mouths met with desperate hunger. Weeks of careful distance exploding into passion that made her knees weak. Jessie's hands tangled in his hair while he pulled her closer, deeper, until she was straddling his lap and pressing against him with abandon that would have terrified her rational mind. His hands explored the curve of her waist, fingers trailing fire along her spine as she arched into his touch. The silk blouse that had seemed professional and appropriate this morning now felt like an unbearable barrier between her skin and his seeking hands. We should stop, Aiden murmured against her neck. But his hands continued their exploration, tracing patterns that made her pulse race. Should we? Jessie gasped, knowing they were crossing a line that would change everything between them forever. Outside, thunder crashed with perfect timing, and Jessie realized there was no going back to pretending this was anything but inevitable. Jessie floated through the next morning on a cloud of wine-soaked memories and the lingering taste of Aiden's kiss. Her professional facade barely concealing the woman who'd discovered passion in storm-darkened rooms. She was fumbling with her keys outside her apartment door when Mrs. Patterson emerged from the unit across the hall like a spider sensing vibrations in her web. "Good morning, dear," the 70-something woman said with false brightness, her sharp eyes cataloging Jessie's slightly rumpled appearance with predatory interest. "I couldn't help but notice you've been having overnight guests lately." Jessie's stomach clenched as she recognized the tone, the same careful politeness that preceded neighborhood association meetings and property value discussions. "Just helping someone out during the storm, Mrs. Patterson." "Oh, I'm sure you were being charitable." Mrs. Patterson's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "But you know how people talk, especially about young women living alone with questionable company. We have to think about safety in a building like this." The emphasis on safety carried implications that made Jessie's blood pressure spike. Before she could respond, Aiden appeared at the top of the stairwell, carrying coffee and pastries. His presence filling the narrow hallway with warmth that suddenly felt dangerous under Mrs. Patterson's scrutinizing gaze. "Morning," he said easily, but Jessie caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. The careful neutrality that spoke of experience with conversations like this. Mrs. Patterson's assessment was swift and thorough-taking in his height, his casual clothes, the easy familiarity with which he approached Jessie's door. Her smile became razor-sharp. "How nice. I don't believe we've been introduced." "Aiden Brad," he replied, with professional courtesy that couldn't quite mask the wariness in his dark eyes. "Well, Mr. Brad, I hope you're finding our neighborhood welcoming." The pause before welcoming carried the weight of judgment wrapped in politeness. "We do pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards here." Jessie felt protective fury rise in her chest like wildfire. This woman who'd borrowed her hedge trimmer and smiled over morning coffee was now standing in their shared hallway, reducing Aiden to a threat based on nothing more than assumptions and prejudice wrapped in concern for property values. "Aiden's been wonderful," Jessie said, her corporate voice cutting through the hallway air like steel. "He fixed my cabinet door, something maintenance has been ignoring for months." Mrs. Patterson's eyes glittered with satisfaction, as if Jessie's defense had confirmed every suspicion. "How? Handy. Well, I should let you get to work, dear. Important to maintain professional appearances, isn't it?" As the older woman retreated into her apartment with pointed glances over her shoulder, Jessie realized they'd just fired the opening shot in a war she hadn't known was coming. The Sterling Club's mahogany-paneled dining room epitomized old-money sophistication, where deals were sealed over 20-year scotch and carefully curated connections. Jessie sat across from Harold Hawthorne, the conservative textile magnate whose account could make her career, while her boss Richard orchestrated the evening with practiced charm that came with decades of corporate maneuvering. "Your strategy for our Southeast expansion is exactly what we need," Hawthorne said, his approval warming Jessie more than the expensive wine. "Someone who understands traditional values and proven approaches." Jessie smiled, feeling the satisfaction of professional success coursing through her veins. This was her world, polished, predictable, profitable. The morning's encounter with Mrs. Patterson felt like a distant storm cloud against the golden glow of career advancement. Then Aiden appeared at their table like a magnificent disruption to her carefully ordered universe. He stood there in work clothes that somehow managed to look devastating rather than inappropriate, his presence commanding attention in a room designed to exclude men like him. Jessie's keys dangled from his fingers, the keys she'd forgotten in her rush to maintain professional appearances. "Sorry to interrupt," Aiden said with quiet dignity, his dark eyes finding Jessie's across the pristine white tablecloth. "You left these at home?" The word home hung in the air like a confession. Jessie felt the temperature at their table drop several degrees as Hawthorne's gaze shifted between her and Aiden, with calculation that had nothing to do with business acumen. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his corporate smile freezing into something sharp as winter air. "Thank you," Jessie managed, her professional composure warring with a desire to touch Aiden's hand as she accepted the keys. Their fingers brushed for one electric moment that felt both intimate and exposing under the weight of 3 pairs of watching eyes. Hawthorne's assessment was swift and thorough, taking in Aiden's height, his casual clothes, the easy familiarity between them that spoke of shared mornings and stolen kisses. When his gaze returned to Jessie, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. "Well," Hawthorne said with a kind of careful politeness that preceded withdrawn contracts and canceled meetings. "How? Interesting." Aiden retreated with quiet grace, but the damage was already spreading through the room like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Jessie caught the subtle glances from other tables, the whispered conversations behind raised menus, the way Richard's knuckles had gone white around his wineglass. "Perhaps we should discuss the contract details further in my office," Richard said with forced lightness that fooled no one. "Tomorrow morning." Jessie nodded, knowing that tomorrow's meeting would have nothing to do with Southeast expansion and everything to do with the choice she'd just been forced to make between 2 worlds that refused to coexist. Jessie's heels clicked against her hardwood floors like bullets as she paced her living room, the evening's humiliation burning through her veins like acid. Aiden sat on her couch with dangerous stillness, his dark eyes tracking her movements with the intensity of a man who'd reached the end of his patience. "You looked ashamed," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was more devastating than shouting. standing there in your perfect restaurant with your perfect boss and your perfect client. And I could see it in your eyes. You were ashamed of me. That's not true, Jessie snapped, whirling to face him with defensive fire blazing in her chest. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The expectations, I understand perfectly. Aiden rose from the couch with fluid grace that made her pulse quicken despite her anger. I'm your dirty little secret. Good enough for midnight kisses and fixed cabinet doors, but not good enough to be seen with in public. The accusation hit like a physical blow because part of it's a part that terrified her most, rang with uncomfortable truth. Jessie felt tears of frustration prick her eyes as she struggled to explain a world that demanded conformity as the price of admission. You think this is easy for me? Her voice cracked with emotion she'd been holding back since the restaurant. Watching you walk away while my career imploded? Feeling like I had to choose between loving you and everything I've worked for, Aiden closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his hands framing her face with desperate intensity. Then choose me, he said, his voice rough with need and challenge. Stop hiding what we are. The kiss that followed was nothing like their gentle exploration on the couch. This was claiming possession. Weeks of careful restraint exploding into passion that bordered on violence. Jessie's hands fisted in his shirt as she pulled him closer, deeper. Surrendering to the magnetic force that had been pulling them together since that first storm-soaked night. They stumbled toward her bedroom, in a tangle of seeking hands and desperate whispers. Clothes disappearing like barriers they'd finally stopped pretending they wanted. When Aiden's mouth found the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder, Jessie arched against him with a gasp that was part pleasure, part surrender. Tell me you want this, he murmured against her skin, his hands tracing fire along curves he'd only imagined touching. Tell me you want me. I want you, Jessie breathed, the words falling between them like a declaration of war against every rational thought that had kept them apart. God help me. I want all of you. When he finally claimed her completely, Jessie discovered that some lines, once crossed, changed everything, including the woman brave enough to cross them. The mahogany walls of Richard's corner office felt like a tribunal as Jessie sat across from her boss, still glowing from the night she'd spent in Aiden's arms but trying to project the professional composure that had once come so naturally. Richard's silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his expression carrying the kind of calculated disappointment that preceded corporate executions. Let's address the elephant in the room, Richard began, his Mont Blanc pen clicking against legal pads with mechanical precision. Your performance at dinner last night created a situation that requires immediate attention. Jessie's spine straightened. Muscle memory from years of boardroom battles warring with the new softness Aiden's touch had awakened in her. If this is about Hawthorne called this morning, Richard interrupted with surgical precision. He's withdrawing his account, cited concerns about our firm's judgment in personnel matters. The pause before judgment carried the weight of professional death sentences. He specifically mentioned feeling uncomfortable with the company you keep. The words hit like ice water. Jessie felt the careful world she'd built over a decade of 60-hour weeks and strategic networking crumbling beneath the weight of one moment's honesty. Hawthorne's textile empire represented 30% of her annual billings to Foundation, upon which her reputation stood. My personal relationships have no bearing on my professional capabilities, Jessie said carefully, her corporate training warring with protective fury that burned in her chest like wildfire. Richard's laugh held no humor. Don't they? You're representing million-dollar portfolios to conservative clients who expect certain standards. Your credibility depends on perception as much as performance. He leaned forward with predatory focus. And the perception of our Rising star cohabitating with a blue-collar worker raises questions about your decision-making. The coded language felt like slaps. Jessie understood now that this wasn't about professional standards. It was about maintaining the careful segregation that kept their world comfortable and predictable. Aiden's crime wasn't being her lover. It was being the wrong kind of lover for someone in her position. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Jessie's voice remained steady despite the earthquake in her chest. Richard's smile was sharp as surgical steel. "End this relationship. Transfer to our Phoenix office for a fresh start. Or we'll be forced to terminate your employment for conduct detrimental to the firm's reputation." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword. Jessie realized she was being asked to choose between the career she'd sacrificed everything to build and the man who'd made her feel truly alive for the first time in years. Her privileged world demanded conformity as the price of admission. Kane was a rebellion they wouldn't tolerate. But as she sat in that sterile office, Jessie wondered if a life that required her to deny love was worth preserving at all. Jessie moved through the next week like an actress playing a role she'd forgotten how to inhabit. Her smile bright as broken glass, while Richard's ultimatum echoed in her head like a death sentence. She researched Phoenix apartments during lunch breaks, drafted resignation letters she couldn't bring herself to send, and pretended normalcy while her world crumbled in corporate speak and impossible choices. "You're quiet tonight," Aiden observed. Over dinner, his dark eyes studying her face with the intensity that had first undone her careful defenses. "Everything okay at work? It's just the usual stress." Jessie lied, the words tasting like ashes as she pushed pasta around her plate. Big presentation coming up. But when Aiden reached across the table to take her hand, she pulled him into her bedroom with desperate urgency that had nothing to do with desire, and everything to do with memorizing the feel of his touch before. She lost it forever. Their lovemaking that night was frantic, almost violent in its intensity. Jessie's hands mapping every muscle, every scar, every perfect imperfection she'd soon be forced to forget. "Jessie," Aiden whispered against her throat as she moved above him with desperate precision. "What's wrong? You feel like you're saying goodbye?" The accuracy of his observation shattered something inside her chest. Jessie captured his mouth in a kiss designed to silence questions she couldn't answer, pouring all her love and regret and terror into the connection between their bodies. When she finally collapsed against his chest, tears she'd been holding back for days leaked onto his skin like accusations. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the words carrying the weight of confession and apology wrapped in silk. Sheets and impending loss dot by day. She played the dutiful employer researching Phoenix office space, updating her resume, preparing for a fresh start that felt like execution. The apartment listings blurred together through tears she refused to shed at work. One-bedroom units with mountain views, corporate housing packages, a new life that would require her to pretend Aiden had never existed. Looking at vacation rentals. Aiden asked one evening, finding her laptop open to Arizona real estate sites. "Just browsing," Jessie said quickly, closing the screen with hands that trembled. Despite her corporate training in crisis management, but the lies were creating distance between them like poison in their morning coffee. Aiden's kisses became questioning, his touches more careful, as if he sensed the emotional walls she was rebuilding around her heart. The domesticity that had once felt natural now carried the weight of borrowed time, every shared meal another step toward inevitable goodbye. Jessie realized she was grieving a love that wasn't dead yet, preparing for a funeral while the patient still breathed in her arms each night. Jessie thought she'd hidden the evidence, well-printed apartment listings tucked beneath quarterly reports. Browser histories cleared like crime scenes, Phoenix job. Applications buried in folders marked with corporate euphemisms. But when she returned from her meeting with a Phoenix-based headhunter, She found Aiden standing in her living room holding the damning papers like a prosecutor presenting evidence. One bedroom, downtown loft. He read from the real estate listing, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that preceded explosions. Great starter apartment for young professional. Move-in ready. His dark eyes found hers across the room. Thoughtful of you to find me a place. Jessie's stomach dropped as she realized. Her careful deception had crumbled like a house of cards. The apartment listings she'd printed under the guise of helping him transition to independence now looked exactly like what they were: preparation for abandonment disguised as generosity. Aiden, I can explain. Can you? He set the papers down with deliberate precision, his movements carrying the controlled fury of a man who discovered betrayal in the hands that had touched him with love just hours before. Because from where I'm standing, this looks like an elaborate plan to get rid of me. The accusation hit like a physical blow because it was true and not true. Jessie had been planning his departure, but not because she wanted him gone. 'Cause Richard's ultimatum had left her with choices that felt like choosing which limb to sever. It's not what you think, Jessie said desperately, but even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. Then tell me what it is. Aiden's voice cracked with pain that made her chest tighten. Tell me why the woman who said she loved me is secretly planning my exit strategy. The hurt in his eyes shattered her remaining defenses. Jessie sank onto her couch as weeks of suppressed panic finally overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. Richard gave me an ultimatum: end our relationship or lose my job. I thought if I could just ... If you had your own place, maybe we could. What Aiden's laugh held no humor. Sneak around. Meet in hotel rooms. Keep me as your guilty pleasure. While you maintain your professional reputation, I was trying to protect us both, Jessie whispered. Tears she'd been holding back for days, finally spilling over. You were trying to protect yourself, Aiden countered with devastating accuracy. Just like at the restaurant. Just like with Mrs. Patterson, when push comes to shove, you choose the safe path. The words hung between them like a chasm neither could cross. Jessie realized that in trying to save their relationship, she'd destroyed the trust that made it worth saving. The Phoenix transfer papers sat on Richard's mahogany desk like a death warrant as Jessie stared at the signature line that would seal her fate. Around the conference table, faces she'd worked beside for years watched with the careful neutrality of colleagues who'd already written her professional obituary. The Phoenix office is excited to have someone of your caliber, Richard said with the false warmth of a funeral director. Fresh start, new clients, none of the ... complications that have affected your judgment here. Jessie's pen hovered over the contract as she thought of Aiden's face when he discovered her deception. The hurt in his eyes that had haunted her sleepless night. She'd built this career on calculated decisions and controlled risks, but sitting in this sterile room, she realized the biggest risk was losing the man who'd made her feel truly alive. I can't do this, Jessie said quietly, setting down the pen like it had burned her fingers. Richard's eyebrow arched with practiced disappointment. Jessie, be reasonable. This is a generous offer considering I quit. The words exploded from her with surprising force, years of suppressed authenticity finally breaking through corporate conditioning. I won't sacrifice love for a job that demands I pretend half my heart doesn't exist. She was out the door before Richard could respond, her heels clicking against marble floors as she ran toward the elevator with desperate urgency. The city blurred past her taxi window as she prayed she wasn't too late, that Aiden's pride hadn't already carried him. Beyond her reach, her apartment building's lobby buzzed with the usual evening activity, Mrs. Patterson collecting mail, the Henderson family returning from soccer practice. Normal people living normal lives that didn't require them to choose between love and survival. Jessie burst through the glass doors like a woman possessed and froze. Aiden stood by the elevators with 2 suitcases, his face carved from granite as he waited for escape from her carefully ordered world. Their eyes met across the marble expanse, and Jessie felt her heart shatter and rebuild simultaneously. "Don't go," she said, her voice carrying across the lobby with desperate clarity. "I chose you. I quit my job. I told Richard to keep his ultimatum. I chose you." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Patterson's mouth fell open as Jessie crossed the lobby with determined grace. Her professional armor finally abandoned for silk and honesty and the kind, a courage that came from almost losing everything. When Aiden's arms closed around her in a kiss that tasted like forgiveness and forever, Jessie heard Mrs. Patterson's scandalized gasp and realized she'd never cared less about neighborhood approval in her life. 6 months later, Jessie woke in their sun-drenched loft to the sound of Aiden's laugh drifting from the kitchen, mixed with the rich aroma of coffee that had become the soundtrack to her new life. Their apartment bore the fingerprints of 2 people who'd stopped pretending they belonged in separate worlds, tools organized beside her marketing awards. Their photos scattered across exposed brick walls like declarations of belonging. "Morning." "Beautiful," Aiden called out as she padded toward him in silk pajamas that no longer felt like armor against judgment. The sight of him, shirtless, at their stove, muscles moving with fluid grace as he flipped pancakes, still made her pulse quicken with the same electric awareness from that first, storm-soaked night. Jessie's freelance consulting firm had exploded, beyond her wildest projections, attracting clients who valued authenticity over corporate conformity. The irony wasn't lost on her that leaving Richard's suffocating world had opened doors to opportunities she'd never imagined, businesses hungry for fresh perspectives that came from someone brave enough to choose love over safety. Sarah Martinez called, Jessie said, settling against the counter where Aiden could wrap his arms around her waist. "She wants to discuss the Henderson Project expansion, apparently." Word is spreading about the consultant who understands real relationships with communities. Aiden's contracting business had flourished alongside her rebellion, its reputation for quality craftsmanship attracting clients who appreciated skill over social connections. The projects that had once represented financial survival now felt like artistic expression shared between equals, who'd found their footing in a world that had tried to separate them. "Think we can scandalize the neighbors with a celebration?" Aiden murmured against her neck, his hands sliding beneath silk to trace the curve of her spine with possessive familiarity. Jessie turned in his arms, her fingers exploring the sculpted planes of his chest as morning light painted golden highlights across his dark skin. "What did you have in mind?" His answer came in the form of a kiss that tasted like coffee and promises, his hands cupping her face with the reverent touch of a man who'd almost lost everything precious. Jessie melted against him, silk pajamas becoming an unbearable barrier between her skin and his seeking hands. They moved together toward their bedroom with the fluid grace of lovers who'd learned each other's rhythms, who no longer needed to hide their desire behind closed doors and whispered confessions. When Aiden's mouth found the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder, Jessie arched against him with a gasp that was pure pleasure. No longer tinged with fear of discovery, their lovemaking carried none of the desperate urgency that had marked their hidden affair. This was possession, confidence, the deep satisfaction of 2 people who'd fought for the right to love each other and won something more precious than social acceptance. Jessie's hands mapped every muscle, every scar, every perfect imperfection that belonged to her now without apology or shame. When Aiden moved above her with passionate certainty, their eyes locked in intimate connection that spoke of shared battles and hard-won victories. Jessie felt herself soaring toward completion that was both physical release and emotional triumph, the woman who'd once hidden her desires. now claiming them with fierce joy. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like home and satisfaction, the afternoon sun streaming through windows that no longer needed curtains to hide their love. Jessie traced lazy patterns on Aiden's chest as he played with strands of her blonde hair, both lost in the peaceful contentment that came from being exactly where they belonged. "I love our life," Jessie whispered against his skin, the words carrying weight of gratitude for storms weathered and battles won. "I love you," Aiden replied, his voice rich with the same wonder that had colored their first kiss, now seasoned with the security of forever.